The scent of sizzling burgers hung in the air, blending with the comforting sounds of a lazy Sunday afternoon, laughter rippling through the group, the occasional clink of glass bottles, and the soft rustling of leaves in the warm breeze. It was the kind of day meant for relaxation, the kind where everyone's guard was down, and time seemed to stretch. Families gathered around picnic tables, children darted across the grassy field, and the faint melody of a distant ice cream truck added to the idyllic setting. In the middle of it all stood Jack Carter. To most people, Jack looked like any other guest at the barbecue. He wore a plain, faded shirt tucked into well-worn jeans, his sneakers scuffed from years of use. His hair, more salt than pepper now, curled slightly at the edges of his sun-tanned face. His eyes were calm, his expression soft but not particularly memorable. Standing behind the grill, carefully flipping burgers, he seemed like the kind of man you'd expect to find at a neighborhood gathering, quiet, unassuming, and content. But Jack Carter wasn't just another neighbor. No one at the barbecue knew much about Jack beyond the basics. He had moved to the quiet suburb a few years ago, buying a modest house at the end of a tree-lined street. He wasn't one to talk much about himself, and when asked about his past, he'd offer a vague answer and a polite smile. "I've done a bit of traveling," he'd say, or, "just lived a regular life, nothing fancy." He always steered the conversation back to whoever was asking. It wasn't that he was unfriendly, far from it. Jack was the kind of man who would help you fix your fence without asking for anything in return or mow your lawn while you were on vacation. But there was something about him, something subtle and hard to pinpoint, that hinted at more. It wasn't in his words, but in the way he carried himself. He moved with a quiet precision, as if every step, every action, had been considered and planned. He never raised his voice, but when he spoke, people tended to listen. And his eyes, sharp, steady, and always scanning the surroundings, seemed to hold a depth that most overlooked. Jack didn't mind being overlooked. In fact, he preferred it. For Jack, life in this sleepy suburban town was exactly what he wanted. After years of chaos, danger, and things he'd rather forget, he had embraced the quiet. There was a peace in grilling burgers at a family barbecue, in exchanging small talk about the weather, in being just one of the neighbors. But Jack Carter had a past. A past he had worked hard to bury, one that he rarely allowed himself to think about. It wasn't just distant memories of the life he used to lead, it was a life he had walked away from, leaving behind the man he had once been. Yet, as much as Jack wanted to believe that his past was truly behind him, the truth was that it never really left. It lingered, just beneath the surface, in the way he instinctively chose a seat with his back to the wall at restaurants, in the way his ears perked up at the sound of an engine that didn't belong, and in the way his hands could still move faster than most eyes could follow. The barbecue was a typical suburban gathering. Tables were loaded with plates of hot dogs, potato salad, and bowls of chips. Parents chatted in groups while keeping half an eye on their kids, who were running in and out of the trees that lined the park. Someone had brought a Bluetooth speaker, and soft country music played in the background. The host, a jovial man named Greg, was cracking jokes as he refilled a cooler with ice and drinks. "Jack, you're a master on that grill," Greg called out, raising a beer in salute. Jack responded with a small smile and a nod, flipping a burger with the ease of someone who had done it 100 times. He wasn't one for the spotlight, but he appreciated the camaraderie. Nearby, a young boy, probably no older than 7, tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, can I get a burger now?" he asked, his eyes locked on the grill. "Not yet, sweetie," his mother said with a laugh. "Let Mr. Carter finish cooking them first." "Call me Jack," Jack said kindly, glancing over his shoulder. His voice was even and calm, with a warmth that put people at ease. It was moments like these that reminded Jack why he had chosen this life. The simplicity, the normalcy, it was everything he had craved during those long years when his life had been anything but normal. But normal didn't last forever. and Jack knew that better than most. As he turned another burger, his hands steady and practiced, a faint sound in the distance caught his attention. It was subtle at first, blending with the hum of the barbecue, the distant roar of engines. Jack's grip on the spatula tightened ever so slightly. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the kind of noise that belonged in this quiet park, surrounded by suburban streets and families enjoying their Sunday. It was rough, aggressive, and unapologetically out of place. Jack didn't turn toward the sound. Instead, he glanced around the park, taking in the faces of the guests. Most were laughing and chatting, oblivious to the growing rumble. A few looked up, their expressions puzzled but unconcerned. Jack's eyes flicked back to the grill. He focused on his task, flipping the burgers and arranging the buns as if nothing was out of the ordinary. But inside, his mind was already working, assessing the situation, preparing. The engines grew louder, and Jack could tell they were close now, too close to be passing through. He didn't need to look to know what was coming. He had been through too much not to recognize the sound of trouble. Jack Carter had spent years training to notice the things others missed, to stay calm under pressure, and to act when the moment called for it. He hadn't needed those skills in a long time. But that didn't mean he had forgotten them. And as the roar of the motorcycles finally reached the edge of the park, Jack knew one thing for sure. The quiet life he had worked so hard to build was about to be tested. The sound of the approaching engines was impossible to ignore now, a low, guttural rumble that filled the air and swallowed the chatter of the barbecue. Jack didn't turn his head or change his pace. To anyone watching, he looked like a man entirely focused on his grill. But beneath that calm exterior, his mind was already analyzing, preparing, and adjusting to the shift in atmosphere. The first bike came into view. It was large and loud, with polished chrome that gleamed in the sunlight. The rider, wearing a leather jacket with frayed edges and a pair of dark sunglasses, slowed as he approached the park's entrance. A second bike followed, then a third, until a total of 6 riders had come into view. They idled just beyond the picnic area, their engines growling like a pack of wolves surveying unfamiliar territory. Jack's hands continued to work the grill, but his eyes subtly flicked toward the group. The bikers were clearly out of place. Their leather jackets bore patches and emblems, none of which looked friendly, and their body language screamed of men who thrived on intimidation. Most of the guests had noticed them now. Conversations trailed off, replaced by a quiet unease. Parents pulled their children a little closer, whispering reassurances that felt as much for themselves as for their kids. Greg, the barbecue's host, stepped forward, his jovial expression faltering. "Hey there," Greg called out, trying to sound confident but coming off more nervous than he intended. "Can we help you folks with something?" The lead biker, a tall man with a thick beard and a sneer that seemed permanently etched into his face, removed his sunglasses and scanned the gathering. His eyes landed on Greg, and he smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that carried no warmth. "Just passing through," he said, his voice gravelly and loud enough to carry across the park. "Nice little get-together you've got here." Greg nodded quickly, eager to de-escalate. "Yeah, just a family barbecue. We're not looking for any trouble." The biker's smile widened, as if the very mention of trouble was an invitation. He revved his engine, the noise startling a few children nearby, who clung to their parents. "Trouble?" he echoed, feigning surprise. "Now, why would you think we'd be looking for trouble?" Jack watched the interaction out of the corner of his eye. He could see it in the biker's stance, the way he carried himself. This man wasn't here by accident. He was testing the waters, pushing just enough to see how the group would react. The other bikers began to dismount, one by one. They moved slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone was watching them. They laughed among themselves, the sound low and mocking, as if they were in on a joke that no one else understood. Jack stayed silent, flipping the last burger and placing it onto a plate. He picked up a towel and wiped his hands, his movements steady and controlled. He didn't need to step in, at least, not yet. Greg, to his credit, was trying to hold his ground. "Look, guys," he said, forcing a polite tone. "This is a family event. Maybe you could move along and let us enjoy our afternoon." The lead biker stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He towered over Greg, who instinctively took a small step back. "Funny thing about families," the biker said, his voice dripping with mockery. "They've got a way of attracting visitors." Jack set down the towel and finally turned to face the group. His movement was casual, almost lazy, but his presence was impossible to ignore. He didn't say anything, he just looked at the lead biker, his sharp blue eyes locking onto the man like a hawk sizing up its prey. The biker noticed. For a split second, his bravado faltered, and he shifted uncomfortably under Jack's gaze. But the moment passed quickly, and he smirked, turning his attention back to Greg. "Who's that?" the biker asked, jerking his thumb in Jack's direction. "Your chef." Greg glanced at Jack, unsure of what to say. Jack stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the bikers with a slow, deliberate stride. "Name's Jack," he said simply, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made everyone listen. The lead biker chuckled, glancing back at his crew. "Well, Jack," he said mockingly, "why don't you whip us up a couple of those burgers? We're starving after our ride." Jack's face remained impassive. "Barbecues for friends and family," he said evenly. "Don't see how you fit into either category." The air grew tense. The bikers laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laughter that came from genuine humor. It was sharp and mean, meant to intimidate. One of the younger bikers, a wiry man with tattoos snaking up his neck, stepped forward. "You got a mouth on you, old man," he sneered. Jack didn't respond. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. He just stood there, his hands at his sides, calm and unmovable. The lead biker narrowed his eyes, studying Jack more closely now. There was something about him that didn't add up, something that didn't fit the picture of a harmless suburban guy at a barbecue. "What's your deal?" the biker asked, his tone less mocking and more curious. Jack tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then he shrugged. "Just a guy who likes a quiet life," he said. The biker didn't believe him. "Yeah," he said, stepping closer. "Quiet life, huh? You don't look like the quiet type to me." Jack met his gaze without flinching. Looks can be deceiving. The bikers exchanged glances, sensing that something was off but unable to put their finger on it. The lead biker hesitated, his bravado wavering. He didn't know who Jack Carter was, but something about the man made him uneasy. Jack, meanwhile, remained perfectly still. He knew exactly what was happening. The bikers were trying to assert dominance, to scare the group into submission. It was a tactic he'd seen before, one he'd dealt with more times than he cared to remember. But this wasn't the battlefield, and these men weren't his enemies. Not yet. "Look," Jack said, his tone measured, "why don't you and your friends move along? No one here's looking for trouble." The lead biker bristled at the suggestion, his pride stung. "And what if we don't feel like moving along?" he asked, his voice rising. Jack's eyes didn't waver. "Then that's your choice," he said. "But you won't like how it ends." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken tension. The bikers seemed to sense that they were standing on the edge of something they didn't fully understand. The lead biker's smirk returned, though it was weaker now, less confident. "We'll see about that," he muttered, turning back toward his crew. Jack watched them carefully, his posture relaxed but ready. He wasn't hoping for a fight, but if one came, he would be prepared. For now, the bikers seemed content to linger, their laughter and jeers filling the uneasy air. Jack returned to the grill, his movements steady and deliberate, but his eyes never strayed far from the intruders. This wasn't over. Not yet. The peace of the gathering shattered as the bikers' engines echoed through the park, drowning out the soft hum of conversation and the playful shouts of children. 6 of them rolled in, their motorcycles gleaming under the sun, polished but menacing. Each rider wore a leather jacket adorned with patches, skulls, flames, and names that seemed to promise danger. Heads turned, conversations halted, and the laughter faded. It was as if the park itself had fallen silent, holding its breath. The bikers parked near the picnic tables, their boots crunching on the gravel as they dismounted. They moved with an air of arrogance, their laughter coarse and mocking as if they owned the place. The leader of the group was hard to miss. A burly man with a beard that looked more like a thicket than facial hair, he had a presence that commanded attention. His eyes scanned the crowd, gleaming with a predatory curiosity. He smirked when his gaze landed on the gathering near the grill. "Well, well," the leader said, his voice rough and dripping with mockery. "Looks like someone forgot to send us an invitation to the party." Jack Carter, standing at the grill, didn't so much as glance up. His focus remained on the burgers, flipping them one by one with practiced ease. Around him, the atmosphere shifted. The once lively group was now uneasy, exchanging nervous glances and murmurs. Some parents subtly stepped closer to their children, instinctively protective. "Hey, old man," one of the bikers called out, his tone taunting. He was younger, wiry, with tattoos covering his arms and neck. "Think you can fix us a plate?" Jack finally looked up, but not at the biker. He set the spatula down, wiped his hands on a towel, and surveyed the group with calm, steady eyes. "Barbecues for friends and family," he said evenly, his tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. The wiry biker bristled, clearly not used to being brushed off. He stepped forward, his boots scuffing loudly against the ground. "What's that supposed to mean, huh? You saying we're not welcome?" Jack's expression didn't change. He didn't blink or flinch. "That's exactly what I'm saying." The tension in the air thickened. Greg, the barbecue's host, stepped forward, clearly trying to defuse the situation. "Now, look," he said, his voice placating. "We're just out here having a family day. No trouble, no drama. How about you guys just move along, and we'll forget this happened?" The leader's smirk widened, his hand resting on the handlebar of his bike as if he was considering the suggestion. He tilted his head, looking Greg up and down before chuckling. "Move along? That's cute. What if we don't feel like it?" Jack could see Greg's confidence faltering. The host wasn't a confrontational man, and it showed. Jack quietly stepped away from the grill, moving just close enough to make his presence known but not enough to escalate the situation. One of the bikers, a stocky man with a shaved head, cracked his knuckles loudly. "Yeah, what if we want to stay?" he said, his voice challenging. Greg opened his mouth to respond, but Jack's calm voice cut through the growing noise. "You don't want to stay?" The words weren't shouted. Jack didn't need to raise his voice. But the way he said them, calm, certain, and final, made everyone pause. The leader turned his attention fully to Jack now, his expression shifting from amusement to something more calculating. "And why's that?" he asked, stepping forward. Jack didn't move. "Because this is a family event," he said simply. "And families don't take kindly to uninvited guests." The leader laughed, though the sound lacked humor. "You've got guts, old man," he said, shaking his head. "But guts can only get you so far." Jack's lips quirked into the faintest hint of a smile. "So can bravado." The leader's amusement faded, replaced by irritation. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone who looked as unassuming as Jack. "You think you're funny?" he asked, his voice low and threatening. Jack shrugged. I think you're wasting your time here. And you know it? The leader took another step forward, closing the distance between them. He was taller than Jack by a good few inches and broader, too. But Jack didn't seem intimidated. If anything, he looked bored. You've got a lot of nerve, the leader said, his voice dropping to a growl. Jack held his gaze. And you've got a lot to lose, he said, his tone just as calm. The leader stared at him, as if trying to figure out whether Jack was bluffing. Around them, the park was eerily quiet. The bikers' laughter had stopped, replaced by a tense stillness as they watched their leader size up the man in front of him. Greg, standing a few feet away, swallowed hard. Let's not do this, he said, his voice shaking. The leader ignored him, his focus still on Jack. You don't look like much, he said, his eyes narrowing. But there's something about you. Something I don't like. Jack's smile didn't reach his eyes. The feeling's mutual. The leader's hands curled into fists, but before he could say anything else, one of the other bikers stepped forward. He was younger, with a shaved head and a jagged scar running down his cheek. Come on, Vince, he said, addressing the leader. This place is Lame. Let's just go. Vince hesitated, clearly weighing his options. He didn't like being told what to do, even by his own crew. But he also didn't like the way Jack was looking at him, calm, steady, and completely unafraid. Finally, Vince stepped back, breaking the tension. Fine, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. We'll go. But don't think we're done here, old man. Jack didn't respond. He simply watched as the bikers mounted their motorcycles and revved their engines, the roar deafening in the quiet park. As they sped off, the tension in the air slowly began to dissipate. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, and parents ushered their children back toward the picnic tables. Greg let out a shaky breath, turning to Jack. Thanks for stepping in, he said, his voice heavy with relief. Jack nodded but didn't say anything. He returned to the grill, his movements as calm and steady as they'd been before the interruption. But inside, he knew this wasn't over. The bikers would be back. And next time, they wouldn't leave so easily. The hum of tension still lingered in the air long after the bikers left, like the echoes of their roaring engines. The barbecue guests tried to regain a sense of normalcy, but the carefree laughter from earlier was gone. Parents whispered to each other in worried tones, their eyes darting toward the park entrance as if expecting the bikers to reappear any second. Jack noticed it all. He didn't say much, though. He returned to flipping burgers, methodically arranging them on the platter. His calm demeanor seemed out of place after what had just happened, but for Jack, this was far from his first brush with confrontation. Greg hovered nearby, visibly shaken but trying to put on a brave face. Jack, he said, his voice low, those guys, they look serious. You think they'll come back? Jack didn't answer immediately. He slid a perfectly grilled burger onto a bun, carefully topping it with a slice of cheese before finally speaking. Probably, he said, his tone matter of fact. Men like that don't take kindly to being told no. Greg's face paled. What should we do? Should we call the police? Jack set down the spatula and looked at Greg. Calling the cops might make them angrier. These guys thrive on intimidation. They want a reaction. They'll come back to see if they can get one. Greg shifted uncomfortably. So what do we do? Jack wiped his hands on a towel and looked out over the park. We keep the kids safe. Make sure everyone knows to stay together. And we wait. The simplicity of Jack's response unnerved Greg. Wait for what? He asked. For them to show their hand, Jack replied, his gaze unwavering. Greg didn't fully understand what Jack meant, but something about his tone made it clear that Jack wasn't worried, at least, not for himself. As the afternoon wore on, The barbecue slowly found its rhythm again. People began eating, the aroma of grilled meat and tangy barbecue sauce filling the air once more. Children played cautiously, their parents keeping a watchful eye on the park entrance. Jack, as usual, kept to himself, but he was far from idle. He observed everything: the layout of the park, the placement of the picnic tables, and even the subtle shifts in the crowd's mood. He noted who seemed most on edge and who could be counted on to keep calm if things escalated. His years of training had taught him the value of preparation. Jack hadn't always been the quiet, unassuming man flipping burgers at a family barbecue. Once, he'd been something very different. Those skills, honed in places far more dangerous than this suburban park, hadn't dulled with time. And now, as the shadows grew longer and the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Jack felt a familiar twinge in his gut. The bikers weren't done. The first sign of their return was subtle: a distant rumble, barely audible over the sounds of the barbecue. Jack heard it before anyone else, his ears tuned to the low growl of motorcycle engines. He straightened slightly, his eyes scanning the tree line. The rumble grew louder, and this time, others noticed. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, heads turning toward the source of the sound. The carefree atmosphere that had been tentatively rebuilt crumbled in an instant. "They're back," someone whispered, their voice tinged with fear. Greg moved toward Jack, panic evident in his every step. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice trembling. Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped away from the grill, his movements deliberate and calm. He wiped his hands on his jeans and adjusted his stance, his eyes fixed on the park's entrance. The bikers appeared moments later, their motorcycles emerging from the tree line like predators stalking their prey. They moved in a tight formation, their engines growling in unison. There were more of them this time, 8 instead of 6. Vince, the leader, was at the head of the pack. His smirk was back, wider and more menacing than before. He slowed his bike as he approached the group, the other riders fanning out behind him like a pack of wolves encircling their target. Well, Vince said, his voice carrying over the low rumble of the engines. "Looks like the party's still going." Jack stepped forward, placing himself between the bikers and the rest of the group. His posture was relaxed, his hands at his sides, but there was an undeniable authority in the way he carried himself. "Thought you boys would have found somewhere else to be by now," Jack said, his tone calm but firm. Vince laughed, dismounting his bike with a flourish. "And miss all this hospitality?" "Nah, we figured we'd stick around." The other bikers laughed along with him, though their eyes were fixed on Jack. They weren't just here to intimidate, they were sizing him up, trying to figure out why he didn't seem afraid. "This is a family event," Jack said, his voice steady. "You've got no business here." Vince's smile faded, replaced by a sneer. "You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that. But I don't take orders from you." Behind Jack, Greg and the others watched in tense silence. The fear was palpable, but no one dared to move. Jack tilted his head slightly, his eyes locked on Vince. "It's not an order," he said. "It's advice. Take it, and you'll save yourself a lot of trouble." Vince's sneer turned into a scowl. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "You think you're tough, don't you?" he said, his voice low and menacing. "I don't know who you think you are, but you're outnumbered. You can't take us all." Jack didn't blink. "I don't need to." The simple statement hung in the air, its weight impossible to ignore. Vince faltered for a moment, his bravado cracking under the sheer certainty in Jack's voice. But the moment passed quickly, and Vince's scowl deepened. "You're making a big mistake," he said, his tone a mix of anger and frustration. Jack didn't respond. He simply stood his ground, his calm gaze unwavering. The bikers exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering across their faces. They had come here expecting fear, expecting to dominate. But Jack's steady presence was throwing them off balance. Vince clenched his fists, clearly struggling to maintain control of the situation. "You think this is over?" he spat. "It's not. We'll be back." Jack's voice was quiet but firm. "I'll be here." The bikers hesitated for a moment longer before Vince barked an order, and they mounted their bikes. The roar of the engines filled the air as they rode off, their frustration evident in the way they tore down the gravel path. As the dust settled, the barbecue guests let out a collective sigh of relief. Greg approached Jack, his face pale but grateful. "Jack," he said, his voice shaking, "I don't know how you do it. But thank you." Jack nodded, his expression unreadable. "Keep everyone close," he said. "This isn't over." And as he returned to the grill, his mind was already working, planning for the confrontation he knew was inevitable. The bikers surrounded Jack now, their laughter like a pack of hyenas circling prey. The spatula lay on the ground, forgotten, as the tension crackled in the air. The leader of the group, Vince, took another step closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. His smirk widened as he loomed over Jack, looking down at the gray-haired man who seemed so unimposing. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Vince said, his tone a low growl. "We were just looking for a little respect. Maybe a burger. And here you are, trying to play the hero." Jack didn't flinch. He glanced down at the spatula for a moment, then back at Vince, his calm gaze unwavering. "Respect is earned," he said evenly, his voice low but clear. "And you're not getting it by threatening people at a family barbecue." One of the younger bikers snorted, stepping forward to grab a soda can from the table. He popped it open, took a long swig, then crushed it in his fist for emphasis. "You've got guts, old man," he said mockingly, tossing the crumpled can onto the ground. "But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered." Jack's wife, sitting quietly nearby, watched the scene unfold. Her hands rested in her lap, but her fingers gripped the edge of her chair tightly. When Jack glanced her way, she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the kind of nod that said everything and nothing at once, a silent conversation between two people who had faced the world together. Jack sighed softly, wiping his hands on a towel with slow, deliberate movements. He stepped back from the grill, his wiry frame looking almost too slight against the bulk of the men around him. "You don't want to do this," Jack said, his voice steady. Vince barked a laugh, turning to his crew. "Hear that? The old man thinks he's got a choice in this." The bikers joined in, their laughter harsh and grating. But Vince's amusement didn't reach his eyes. He stepped closer to Jack, so close now that their faces were mere inches apart. "You don't scare me," Vince said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Jack tilted his head slightly, studying the man in front of him. For a brief moment, something flickered across his face, not fear, but understanding. "I'm not trying to scare you," Jack replied calmly. "I'm giving you a chance." The simplicity of Jack's statement made Vince hesitate, just for a second. It was barely noticeable, but Jack caught it. One of the other bikers, a wiry man with tattoos snaking up his neck, stepped forward, his patience wearing thin. "Enough of this," he said. "Let's show him who he's dealing with." Jack's wife rose from her seat then, her movements smooth and unhurried. She carried herself with a quiet grace, her eyes steady as she met Jack's gaze. "Don't hurt yourself," she said softly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. The words seemed out of place to the bikers, who exchanged confused glances. But to Jack, they carried weight. He gave her a small nod, then turned his full attention back to Vince and his crew. "You boys want to make a mess of things?" Jack asked, his tone conversational. "Fine. But I'll warn you now, you're not the first." The bikers stared at him, their amusement fading into something closer to unease. Vince scowled, trying to regain control of the situation. "You talk a big game for a guy your age," he snapped. "But talk doesn't mean a damn thing out here." Jack smiled faintly, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're right," he said. "Actions speak louder." With that, Jack moved. It wasn't sudden or frantic, but it was precise, a quick step forward and a sharp twist of his wrist as he grabbed Vince's arm. Before anyone could react, Vince was doubled over, his breath knocked out of him as Jack pressed his thumb into a pressure point near his wrist. The other bikers froze, their bravado evaporating as they watched their leader struggle to break free. "What the hell?" one of them started, but Jack's voice cut through the confusion. "Stay where you are," he said, his tone sharp and commanding. "Unless you want to find out just how bad this can get." The sheer authority in Jack's voice stopped them in their tracks. For the first time, they saw him not as an old man but as something entirely different. Vince growled, trying to wrench his arm free, but Jack's grip was ironclad. "Who the hell are you?" Vince spat, his voice laced with pain and anger. Jack leaned in slightly, his eyes cold and unyielding. "I'm the guy who's giving you one last chance to walk away," he said. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, the confidence they'd worn so proudly now crumbling under the weight of Jack's unexpected skill and composure. "Let him go," one of them barked, but even his voice wavered. Jack released Vince with a slight shove, sending the man stumbling back. "Get your boys and leave," Jack said, his voice steady and resolute. "And don't come back." Vince straightened, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. "This isn't over," he snarled, but the threat felt hollow now. Jack's gaze didn't waver. "It is if you're smart." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, one by one, the bikers began to back away, their bravado replaced by a simmering unease. Vince glared at Jack, his jaw clenched, before finally turning and storming back to his bike. As the roar of their engines faded into the distance, the barbecue guests let out a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding. Greg approached Jack cautiously, his face a mix of awe and confusion. "Jack," he said slowly, "what just happened?" Jack picked up the fallen spatula, brushing the dirt off it. "Just a little misunderstanding," he said casually. Greg shook his head, still trying to process what he'd just seen. "Who are you, really?" Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to his wife, who gave him a small, knowing smile. "Just a guy who doesn't like bullies," Jack said finally. But in his wife's eyes, there was a flicker of something more, something that hinted at a past Jack wasn't ready to share. Not yet. The uneasy quiet that followed the bikers' retreat clung to the park like a lingering shadow. People began murmuring among themselves, some in hushed tones, others outright asking questions. "Did you see that?" one man whispered to his wife. "He didn't even break a sweat." "Who is Jack?" a teenage boy asked his mother, who could only shrug in response, her wide eyes fixed on the unassuming man by the grill. Jack ignored the whispers, focusing instead on straightening the table where the bikers had disturbed the setup. His movements were steady and deliberate, as if nothing out of the ordinary had just occurred. But his wife noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes occasionally darted to the park entrance. Greg couldn't let it go. He stood a few feet away, still trying to wrap his head around what he'd witnessed. Finally, he stepped closer. "Jack," he said, his voice quieter than before, "you've got to tell me. That wasn't normal." Jack glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" Greg threw his hands up, exasperated. "What do I mean? You just took down a guy twice your size with one move, and you didn't even blink. Where did you learn to do that?" Jack shrugged, turning his attention back to the grill. "Experience," he said simply. Greg frowned. "Experience? What kind of experience? You were in the military, weren't you? Jack didn't answer immediately. He flipped a burger, the sizzle of the meat filling the awkward silence. A long time ago, he said at last, his tone even. Greg pressed on. But you didn't just serve, did you? There's something more to it. You're too calm. Too precise. Jack looked at him then, his gaze steady. Let it go, Greg, he said quietly. You don't want to dig too deep. The words sent a shiver down Greg's spine. It wasn't a threat. Jack didn't need to make threats. It was a warning, plain and simple. As the afternoon wore on, the barbecue guests tried to reclaim the festive spirit they'd started with. The kids returned to their games, though they stayed closer to their parents now. The adults resumed their conversations, though the laughter was more subdued. Jack stayed by the grill, his watchful eyes scanning the park even as he worked. He moved with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times before, but his mind was elsewhere. The bikers would be back. He was sure of it. Vince wasn't the kind of man to let a perceived slight go unanswered. Men like him didn't just walk away, they came back, and they came back harder. Jack's wife approached him quietly, her hands clasped in front of her. You did what you had to, she said softly. Jack nodded, not looking at her. I know. But. He sighed, turning to meet her gaze. But it's not over. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm. You can handle it. You always do. Her faith in him was unwavering, and it was both comforting and heavy. Jack had spent years trying to leave his past behind, but moments like this reminded him that it wasn't so easy. As evening began to fall, the barbecue wound down. Families packed up their belongings, and the crowd began to thin. But Jack stayed, his wife by his side. Greg lingered too, his curiosity about Jack outweighing his exhaustion. He sat on a picnic bench, watching as Jack cleaned the grill with practiced efficiency. I still don't get it, Greg said, breaking the silence. You act like this is just another day for you. Jack glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Maybe it is. Greg shook his head. That's not normal, Jack. Most people would have panicked back there. You didn't even flinch. Jack paused, the grill brush in his hand. He looked out over the park, his expression distant. When you've been through enough, you learn to stay calm, he said finally. Greg leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Been through enough? What does that mean? Were you special forces or something? Jack didn't answer right away. He finished cleaning the grill, then set the brush down. Let's just say I've seen things most people don't want to see, he said quietly. Greg's brow furrowed. Like what? Jack met his gaze, his eyes sharp and unyielding. Things that don't leave you, he said simply. The weight of those words hung heavy in the air, silencing any further questions Greg might have had. The last of the guests finally left, leaving Jack and his wife alone in the park. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Jack stood near the grill, his arms crossed as he surveyed the now empty space. They'll come back, he said, more to himself than to his wife. She stepped beside him, her expression calm. And you'll be ready? He nodded, but his jaw tightened. He didn't want this. He didn't want to be the man who had to step up and face danger anymore. But when trouble came knocking, Jack Carter always answered. Go home, he said to her softly. I'll be right behind you. She hesitated, her eyes searching his face. Promise me you'll be careful. I promise. With a final glance, she turned and walked toward their car, leaving Jack alone in the gathering darkness. Jack waited, the stillness of the park settling around him like a blanket. His sharp eyes scanned the tree line, his ears attuned to every sound. And then, faintly at first, he heard the low rumble of engines. He exhaled slowly, his hands relaxing at his sides. "Here we go," he muttered. The bikers returned, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they rolled into the park. There were more of them this time, their numbers bolstered by reinforcements. Vince led the pack, his face a mask of anger and determination. He dismounted his bike with a flourish, his boots crunching on the gravel as he strode forward. "Didn't think you'd still be here, old man," Vince said, his voice dripping with venom. Jack stepped into the light, his calm presence a stark contrast to the chaotic energy of the bikers. "Figured you'd come back," he said evenly. Vince sneered. "You made a fool of me today. And now, I'm going to make sure you regret it." The bikers fanned out behind him, their sheer numbers a show of force. But Jack didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his sharp eyes assessing every movement, every angle. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. This was a reckoning. And Jack Carter was ready. The park seemed to hold its breath. Jack stood in the middle of the group, his posture relaxed but ready, his sharp eyes locked onto the bikers. Vince, their leader, writhed on the ground, clutching his wrist. The others looked between their fallen leader and Jack, their confidence wavering. "You've got to be kidding me," one of them muttered, the bravado in his voice cracking slightly. Jack ignored the comment, his focus never wavering. "Here's how this works," he said evenly. "You leave now, and this ends here. No one gets hurt worse than they already have." Vince struggled to his feet, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. "You think this is over," he snarled. "You're just one guy, old man." Jack tilted his head slightly, a faint, almost amused smile playing at the corners of his lips. "One guy," he repeated. "That's all it's going to take." The air grew heavier with tension as the bikers slowly circled Jack, trying to find an angle, a weakness. But Jack was already calculating, reading their movements, anticipating their next moves. "Enough talking," one of the bikers barked, charging forward with a wild swing. Jack sidestepped effortlessly, his body moving with a grace that seemed impossible for someone his age. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the man's arm, twisted it behind his back, and sent him sprawling to the ground with a sharp push. The others hesitated for a split second before rushing in together, their numbers giving them a false sense of advantage. Jack didn't waste a single movement. Every block, every strike was precise, efficient. Years of training and discipline took over, his body reacting faster than thought. One biker swung a chain at him, but Jack ducked low, sweeping the man's legs out from under him. Another came at him with a knife, but Jack disarmed him with a calculated strike to the wrist, sending the blade clattering to the ground. "Stay down," Jack said, his voice calm but commanding. The younger bikers were quickly learning that brute strength meant nothing against someone who knew exactly how to neutralize it. They moved more cautiously now, circling like predators unsure of their prey. "What's the matter?" Jack asked, his tone almost conversational. "This isn't going the way you thought it would." Vince, watching the chaos unfold, clenched his fists. His pride was on the line now, and he couldn't back down. Drawing a switchblade from his pocket, he lunged at Jack with a roar of frustration. Jack sidestepped again, catching Vince's arm and twisting it sharply. The knife fell from Vince's grip, and Jack shoved him backward. Vince stumbled, his momentum sending him crashing into a nearby picnic table. Jack picked up the fallen knife and tossed it aside, his expression unreadable. "You're out of your depth," he said. "Walk away before this gets worse." But Vince wasn't listening. Scrambling to his feet, he glared at his crew. "What are you waiting for? Get him." The remaining bikers charged again, but it was clear their confidence had been shaken. Jack dispatched them one by one, his movements a masterclass in control and efficiency. A sharp elbow here, A calculated kick there. Each move left another biker on the ground, groaning in pain. As the last of them fell, Jack stood amidst the chaos, his breathing steady. The bikers who were still conscious stared at him with a mix of fear and disbelief. Vince, battered and bruised, glared at Jack, his chest heaving. "You think this makes you a hero?" he spat. Jack shook his head. "No," he said simply. "It just makes me someone who doesn't tolerate bullies." The distant sound of sirens broke the tension. Someone from the barbecue must have called the police. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their fight or what was left of it draining away. "You've got a choice to make," Jack said, his voice steady. "Stick around and explain this to the cops, or get on your bikes and don't come back." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the bikers began retreating, helping their fallen comrades to their feet. Vince lingered, his face a storm of anger and humiliation, but even he knew when to cut his losses. "This isn't over," he muttered, turning to leave. Jack's gaze followed him. "It is if you're smart," he said quietly. As the roar of motorcycles faded into the night, the park fell silent once more. Jack turned to see his wife standing a few feet away, her expression calm but knowing. "You okay?" she asked. Jack nodded, rolling his shoulders. "Nothing I haven't handled before." Greg approached cautiously, his face a mix of awe and confusion. "Jack, what was that?" Jack glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Just old instincts kicking in." Greg shook his head. "Instincts? Jack, you just took down half a gang like it was nothing. What are you?" Jack's expression grew serious. He looked at Greg, then at the remaining barbecue guests, who were watching him with wide eyes. "I was a Marine," he said finally. "For 20 years, I served. Special forces, covert operations, the kind of stuff you don't talk about at the dinner table." The weight of his words hung in the air. "So, you're trained for this kind of thing?" Greg asked, still trying to process what he'd seen. Jack nodded. "Trained to protect. To survive. And to make sure people like them don't hurt anyone else." The police arrived soon after, taking statements from the guests and assessing the damage. Jack kept his explanation simple, emphasizing that he had only acted to defend himself and his family. As the officers wrapped up and the crowd began to disperse, Jack found a quiet moment to sit beside his wife. "You didn't want this life to follow you here," she said softly. "No," Jack admitted. "But sometimes it doesn't give you a choice." She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You did what you had to. That's who you are." Jack looked out over the now empty park, the shadows stretching long in the fading light. "I just hope it's enough to keep them from coming back." His wife smiled faintly. "If they're smart, they won't." And for the first time that day, Jack allowed himself to relax, the weight of the moment finally lifting. As the night deepened, Jack remained seated on the park bench, his wife beside him, the quiet hum of crickets filling the air. Despite the calm, the weight of what had just happened lingered. Jack's body might have been still, but his mind raced, cataloging every detail, every movement from the confrontation. Old habits, ingrained from decades of training, weren't so easily dismissed. His wife broke the silence. "You don't think they'll come back, do you?" Jack exhaled, his gaze fixed on the tree line. "Men like Vince don't give up easily. But they'll think twice before trying again. That much I'm sure of." She nodded, her faith in him unshaken. Still, Jack saw the flicker of worry in her eyes. It wasn't just about tonight. It was about the life they had built together, the quiet, peaceful existence he had promised her. A promise that seemed more fragile now than ever. Greg, who hadn't yet left the park, approached cautiously. He still seemed shaken, but his curiosity outweighed his fear. "Jack, He began hesitantly, "Can I ask you something?" Jack glanced at him, one brow raised. "You've been asking me things all day, Greg. Might as well keep going." Greg chuckled nervously, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fair point. It's just, you said you were in the Marines. Special Forces, right? But this feels like more than that. The way you moved, the way you handled them, it's like you've done this 1,000 times before." Jack leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "When you spend as long as I did in the field, you learn a thing or two. Let's just say tonight wasn't my first time dealing with people who thought they were invincible." Greg frowned. "But why didn't you ever say anything? You've been here for years, and none of us had a clue." Jack's wife answered before he could. "Because that's the way Jack wanted it. He's not the type to wear his past on his sleeve." Jack nodded. "She's right. That life, it's behind me. Or at least, it's supposed to be. I didn't move here to impress people with war stories." Greg studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But I've got to say, Jack, we're lucky to have someone like you around." Jack smiled faintly. "Let's just hope you don't need someone like me again." As Greg walked away, Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His wife placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've done enough for one night," she said gently. "Have I?" Jack murmured. She frowned. "What do you mean?" Jack gestured toward the empty park. "Vince may not come back, but people like him? They're everywhere. No matter where I go, trouble finds a way to follow." "You can't carry the weight of the world, Jack," she said softly. "You've already done your part." Jack turned to her, his expression serious. "But what if doing my part isn't enough? What if the past I'm trying to leave behind keeps pulling me back?" She met his gaze, her own steady and unwavering. "Then you face it, just like you always have. But you don't have to do it alone." The next morning, the events of the previous night were already the talk of the town. News spread quickly in small communities, and by the time Jack and his wife went out for breakfast, people were already whispering and pointing in their direction. "Is that him?" a man at a nearby table muttered. "The guy who took on that biker gang?" "Yeah, that's him," another whispered. "He doesn't look like much, does he?" Jack pretended not to hear, focusing on his coffee. But his wife noticed the way his jaw tightened. "You're a local legend now," she said with a teasing smile. Jack groaned softly. "That's the last thing I wanted." Their conversation was interrupted when the diner door swung open, and Greg walked in, carrying a newspaper. He spotted Jack immediately and made his way over. "You're on the front page," Greg announced, slapping the paper down on the table. Jack sighed, glancing at the headline, "Local Man Fends Off Biker Gang at Family Barbecue." Beneath it was a blurry photo of Jack standing amidst the chaos, his expression calm and unyielding. "Great," Jack muttered, folding the paper and pushing it aside. Greg chuckled. "Come on, Jack, this is a good thing. People around here feel safer knowing someone like you is looking out for them." Jack shook his head. "That's not why I did it, Greg. I'm not looking for attention or gratitude. I just want to live my life in peace." Greg's expression grew serious. "I get that. But you've got to know, word like this spreads. Vince's crew isn't going to be the only ones interested in you now." Jack spent the rest of the day trying to lay low, but it was clear that his life had changed overnight. Neighbors stopped by to thank him, strangers waved at him in the street, and the local sheriff even dropped in to commend him for his actions. But with every handshake and pat on the back, Jack felt the same nagging unease. Attention like this wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. That night, as he sat on his porch, his wife joined him, her expression thoughtful. "You're thinking about them, Aren't you? Jack nodded. Vince and his crew aren't the type to let this go. And now, with all this attention. You're worried they'll come back, she finished. Jack leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. I don't just worry about them. I worry about what this kind of attention brings. Trouble doesn't need much of an excuse to show up. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. Jack gave her a faint smile. I just hope it doesn't come to that. But Jack's instincts were rarely wrong. Days passed without incident, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. He kept a close eye on his surroundings, watching for anything out of place. And then, late one night, it happened. The faint rumble of motorcycle engines echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment. Jack stood, his senses sharpening as the sound drew closer. He turned to his wife, who had followed him to the window. Stay inside, he said firmly. Her eyes widened. Jack. Stay inside, he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. She nodded reluctantly, watching as he stepped out onto the porch, the cool night air brushing against his face. The bikes came into view, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Vince was at the front, his face set in a grim determination. Behind him were a dozen men, all clad in leather and brimming with hostility. Jack stood his ground, his stance relaxed but ready. You boys don't learn, do you? He called out, his voice carrying through the night. Vince dismounted his bike, his movements deliberate. You humiliated me, he said, his voice low and dangerous. And now, we're going to settle this. Jack's expression didn't waver. You already lost once. You really want to try again? Vince smirked, gesturing to the men behind him. This time, I brought enough help to even the odds. Jack's eyes flicked over the group, assessing their stances, their weapons, their confidence. He nodded slowly. All right, he said quietly. Let's settle this. And with that, the night exploded into chaos. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, but the air was still thick with tension. Jack stood quietly by the grill, the flames flickering softly, his thoughts drifting back to the chaotic moments that had just unfolded. The park, which had once felt like the safest place in the world, now seemed charged with the energy of a storm that had passed. The bikers were gone, but Jack knew it wasn't the end. It never was. Trouble had a way of coming back around when you least expected it. He glanced over at his wife, who was standing by the edge of the porch, her expression unreadable. She had always been his anchor, the calm in the storm, but tonight even she seemed to feel the weight of the confrontation. Are you all right? She asked quietly, her voice tinged with concern. Jack gave her a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Yeah. Just, a little tired. She walked over to him, placing a hand gently on his arm. That was dangerous. I know you can handle yourself, Jack, but... I know, he said, cutting her off softly. I don't want this kind of life for us. But sometimes, you don't have a choice. They don't always give you a choice. His words hung in the air between them. There were no easy answers, no simple way to resolve the kind of trouble that had knocked on their door. And though Jack had handled the situation, he'd done so at the cost of revealing a part of himself that he had long buried. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. Jack pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was Greg. Hey, Greg, Jack answered. What's up? Are you good? Greg asked, his voice urgent. I know what happened, and I just wanted to check in. Jack took a deep breath. Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired. It's over now. Greg's voice softened. You know, Jack, we all owe you one. That was, well, you saved us all. I know it wasn't easy, and it wasn't just about the fight. It was about standing up to them when no one else would. That's something most people can't do. Jack was quiet for a moment, the weight of Greg's words settling in. I didn't do it for anyone else, he said, his voice quieter now. I did it because that's what you do when you don't want to let people walk all over you. They were bullies, Greg. And bullies only respect one thing. What's that? Strength, Jack replied, his voice firm. You show them you won't be intimidated, and they back off. Sometimes it takes more than just words. It takes action. Greg was silent for a moment, processing. Well, whatever you did, it worked. Everyone's talking about it, but it's not just the fight. They're talking about how you handled it. No anger. No drama. Just, control. Jack chuckled softly. That's the Marine in me. We don't get rattled easily. Well, it shows. Anyway, I just wanted to make sure you were okay. The town's grateful for you, Jack. Don't forget that. I won't, Jack replied, his tone warm. Thanks, Greg. I'll see you soon. He hung up, slipping the phone back into his pocket. His wife, still standing beside him, gave him a knowing look. You've always been good at keeping your calm, she said softly. But tonight, you were more than just calm. You were something else. You were. Jack shook his head, cutting her off. I don't want to be that guy. The one everyone looks to when things go wrong. I just want to live a quiet life. No more chaos. No more fighting. She smiled faintly. I know you do, Jack. But sometimes life doesn't give us a choice. You've always known that. Jack nodded, turning back to the grill, the sizzling sound of meat once again filling the quiet night. But as he flipped the burgers, his thoughts were distant. The bikers might have left, but Jack knew their kind always returned. And when they did, he would be ready. The days that followed felt surreal. The quiet life Jack had built over the past few years seemed to slip further out of reach with every passing moment. Neighbors who once only exchanged pleasantries now came up to him with grateful words. Strangers waved at him, their eyes full of admiration, as if he were some kind of hero. But Jack wasn't interested in the attention. He didn't want to be a hero. He just wanted peace. But peace, it seemed, was something that came with a price. The phone calls kept coming. People from all over town checked in, asking if he needed anything, offering support, or just expressing their thanks. Even the local sheriff stopped by one afternoon, tipping his hat and offering a handshake. That was something else, Carter, the sheriff said with a smile. Don't know how you did it, but you saved us all from a real mess. Jack smiled politely but felt the familiar knot of discomfort twist in his stomach. He hadn't asked for this attention, hadn't sought it out. All he'd wanted was to live his life and raise his family in peace. But as the sheriff left, Jack couldn't help but feel the weight of the title that seemed to be thrust upon him, protector. The following weekend, Jack found himself back at the park. It was another quiet afternoon, the kind of day he had once cherished, a day free of tension, free of chaos. His family was there again, gathered around the same picnic tables, eating, laughing, and sharing stories. But this time, things were different. People couldn't stop talking about what had happened. His friends looked at him with a mixture of admiration and awe. He wasn't just the quiet, reserved man anymore. He was someone they admired, someone who had stood his ground when the odds were stacked against him. Jack took it all in stride, but the truth was, he wasn't sure he was ready for this new reality. The man who had quietly retired from the Marines, the man who had longed for a life of solitude, was suddenly someone others looked up to. He had done the right thing, had stood up for himself and his family, but now there were expectations. And expectations, Jack knew, could be dangerous. Later that evening, as the sun began to set and the last of the barbecue guests began to leave, Jack took a moment to sit on the park bench, his eyes fixed on the horizon. His wife joined him, sitting silently by his side. "You okay?" she asked softly, her hand brushing his. Jack nodded, his gaze distant. "Just thinking. About everything that's changed. About how it feels like the world is starting to look at me differently. I don't know if I'm ready for that." She squeezed his hand. "You don't have to be ready, Jack. You just have to be you. The man who stood up for what's right. The man who's always been there when it counts." Jack looked at her, his heart full of gratitude. "I don't deserve all this, you know." "You're wrong," she said with a small smile. "You don't have to wear a cape to be a hero. You've always been one to me." Jack smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over him for the first time in days. Maybe the world was changing, but some things like his family's love would always stay the same. And for the first time in a long time, Jack was content. He had faced the storm and weathered it. The bikers had been driven off. And justice had been served not just with fists, but with strength, honor, and the quiet resolve of a man who refused to be intimidated. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As the sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow over the park, Jack stood by the grill, flipping the last of the burgers. The quiet hum of conversation and the laughter of his family and friends filled the air, replacing the tense silence that had once hung heavy over the gathering. The bikers were long gone, and the park was slowly returning to its peaceful, everyday rhythm. Jack's movements were calm and deliberate, his usual steady presence restored. He didn't need to say much, didn't need to be the center of attention. He was content with just being there, in the moment, with his family around him. It wasn't the kind of life that demanded praise or recognition, it was the kind of life that, at its core, was about peace and the simple things. But in the midst of that quiet, Jack knew something had shifted. Something had changed in the way people saw him. The last of the burgers sizzled on the grill as he turned them over, the aroma filling the air and mingling with the evening's cooling breeze. He could hear the conversations around him, people chatting about the events of the day, how the bikers had been driven off, and how Jack had handled everything with such quiet strength. There was a new respect in their voices, a new understanding. Jack wasn't just the quiet neighbor anymore. He was something more, something they hadn't fully seen before. One of his friends, Mike, who had been sitting on a nearby bench, looked over at Jack as he flipped the last burger. "Hey, Jack," Mike called out, his voice carrying over the group. "I've been meaning to ask you something." Jack turned his head, nodding in Mike's direction. "What's up?" Mike stood up and walked over, joining Jack by the grill. The others seemed to pause, their conversations quieting as they noticed the exchange. There was something in Mike's eyes, a mix of curiosity and respect, that made Jack bristle slightly. He knew what was coming. "Why didn't you tell us about your past?" Mike asked. "I mean, I know we've known each other for a while, but I never knew you were, well, you know, that kind of guy. A Marine. A fighter. A hero, really." Jack didn't flinch. He just looked at Mike, his expression steady, like always. "It's not about where you've been," he said, his voice calm, carrying a quiet authority. "It's about who you choose to be now." He paused for a moment, glancing at the faces of his friends and family gathered around, waiting for his next words. "But sometimes," he continued, his gaze settling back on Mike, "you've gotta remind people that quiet strength isn't weakness." There was a long silence, and then Mike nodded slowly, understanding dawning on him. Jack could see it in his eyes. Mike finally understood. The others had gathered around by now, drawn in by the quiet weight of Jack's words. They were listening, not just to his story, but to what he stood for. The heroics weren't in the past, they were in the way Jack had carried himself in the present, in the way he stood his ground when it mattered most. "That's exactly it, Jack," Greg said, walking over with his wife. "You didn't need to tell us. We knew. And today, you showed us exactly who you are." Jack simply nodded, his calm demeanor not wavering. "No need for speeches," he said with a small smile. "Just do what's right. That's all anyone really needs to know." The group fell silent again, but this time, the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, a quiet acknowledgement of the respect they now had for Jack. They had all seen the way he handled the situation earlier, how he remained composed under pressure, how he stood tall in the face of aggression. And now, they understood that Jack wasn't just the friendly neighbor who kept to himself. He was a man who had been through things, seen things, and had the strength to keep going, even when life tried to throw him off course. He had chosen to leave his past behind, to find peace and build a new life, but he had never forgotten what it meant to stand firm. As the night wore on, the mood lightened, the laughter growing louder as people dug into the last of the food. The tension that had once filled the air had been replaced with a sense of unity, a sense of appreciation for what they all had, for the simple pleasures of life. The day's events had shown everyone something they hadn't expected. Jack wasn't just the man who grilled the burgers or quietly watched from the sidelines. He was someone who, when it came down to it, knew exactly how to handle himself. And more importantly, he knew how to protect the people he cared about. Jack stayed mostly quiet through the rest of the evening, content to sit back and watch as his friends and family enjoyed themselves. But there was a small part of him that had to admit it felt good, the way people now looked at him with admiration and respect. He wasn't looking for accolades or praise, but there was something about the way they treated him now that made him feel like he had done something important, something that had made a difference. The evening slowly wound down, the last guests leaving with promises to meet again soon. Jack's family began to gather up the dishes, and his wife came over to him as he sat on the porch, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the night sky. "You did good today," she said, sitting beside him, her voice soft. "Really good." Jack smiled at her, his arm wrapping around her shoulder. "It wasn't about doing good, babe. It was about doing what needed to be done." He paused, his eyes still fixed on the stars. "Sometimes people forget that you don't have to make a big scene. You don't have to raise your voice to be heard. You just have to stand up and show them who you are." She leaned her head on his shoulder, smiling as she looked up at the night sky with him. "And that's what makes you different," she said softly. "You don't just talk about it. You live it." Jack chuckled, a sound full of warmth and affection. "I don't know if I'd call it living it," he said with a grin. "I'm just a man who tries to do what's right." They sat together in the quiet, the world around them calm and peaceful once again. Jack felt a sense of contentment wash over him. He didn't need to be the hero. He didn't need to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But he also knew that when the time came when the storm blew in, and the darkness threatened to take over, he would always stand tall. He would always be the one to protect those he loved. Because that, above all else, was the true measure of strength. Not in the battles you fought, but in the moments when you chose to stand firm, to protect, and to defend. And Jack knew, deep down, that this was the life he had chosen, to be a man of quiet strength. To never back down, and to never forget who he was, no matter where life took him. As the night grew darker, Jack leaned back in his chair, letting the peaceful silence fill his soul. And for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with himself, knowing that sometimes, the greatest power lies in restraint, in knowing when to stand back, and in remembering that strength doesn't always need to be loud. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one who holds the most power. And in the end, that was all that mattered.